team of Truthseekers is on a mission. Scientists, historians, archaeologists, all on the trail of history's enigmas. Searching for the truth behind the greatest mysteries known to humanity. Genghis Khan is one of the most famous rulers of all time. His fearsome reputation is known the world over. He was a conqueror of almost mythic status and the founding father of the Mongolian nation. Despite all this, we know very little about how he died, and nothing about his final resting place. With no written record, no mausoleum, and little physical evidence, can the tomb of one of history's great men ever be found? In London, our team assemble. Our 4 Truthseekers combine decades of experience in different fields. But they all have one goal: to apply their knowledge and reveal the truth.
There are mysteries, and then there are mysteries.
I have always loved uncovering the secrets of the past.
We need to go back and unpick the untruths from the truths.
Age-old problems that we've been asking ourselves over 100 years, really, can now be solved.
They'll follow the clues left behind, unravel the secrets of the past, separate fact from fiction, and together, they'll uncover the truth behind the greatest mysteries ever.
What's so incredible about Genghis Khan is that he led a people that frankly nobody knew anything about. In Europe, in Asia, they burst out of the steppe and conquered everything before them with grim determination.
When we think about Genghis Khan, he's a man of such a vast empire and huge wealth. If you were to find his grave, it would be a discovery of the ages.
Genghis Khan is one of the most famous and infamous rulers of all time. And as the founding father of the Mongolian nation, he retains almost mythic status even now. He united the nomads who populated the grasslands of Eurasian steppe and set about conquering the world.
This is the story of an empire that burst out of nowhere, led by an incredibly charismatic figure, Genghis Khan, who still fascinates us down the centuries.
Genghis Khan changed the world he was born into forever. He ruled over more people than any Roman emperor and was responsible for more death than any other man in history. There are several stories about how the great warrior finally met his end and where he may be buried. Our Truthseekers are going to find out. Historian Tony McMahon has been looking at the early life of Genghis Khan and how it helped him become a legend.
Genghis Khan created the biggest continuous land empire in history, and for a century, he was feared across the world. He struck terror into his opponents. And yet, for somebody who was such a titanic figure of that time, we have no image, we have none of his words. All we have is a record of his mighty deeds.
Very few facts are known about the life of Genghis Khan, including the exact date and place of his birth, itself an event shrouded in myth and mystery.
The man who came to be known to all of us as Genghis Khan was born in 1162 with the name Temujin. And it's said that as a baby, he had a blackened blood clot clenched in his little fist. And this was seen by his people as a foreshadowing of future greatness.
Temujin was born to a powerful father, Yezugai, chief of the Borjin clan that was part of the Kamag Mongol, a loose confederation of nomadic tribes attempting to secure some peace in an era dominated by conflict.
This is an inhospitable landscape that really forges the identity of those who live on it. And the tribes on the steppe were forever fighting each other. And the Mongolian people knew that in order to survive, they had to trust each other. They had to rely on each other's loyalty.
But this wasn't some indication of Mongolian savagery. This was a time of warfare across the known world.
The world that Genghis Khan was born into was one of extreme violence. Europe was ravaged by war and conflict. And in the Middle East, the Crusades were underway, pitching crusaders against Saracens.
It was a brutal time, and historically brutal times create necessarily brutal leaders. Temujin was only 9 when the truth of this was brought into sharp focus.
The young Temujin is taken by his father, Yesugei, who is the tribal leader, to meet his future wife. This is a child marriage. On his way home, his father is poisoned by the Tatars in some kind of tribal conflict. Hearing the news, Temujin then returns home, determined to claim his birthright, to become the leader of his people.
But his people had other ideas, and on his return, they exile him and his mother and brothers.
They are cast into utter poverty. They're forced to live on rats and rodents. Things could not look more grim for the young Temujin.
Forced to scramble for survival in the mountains, this period of Temujin's life would have a profound effect on his future. He would form an eternal bond with Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain that sheltered his family and protected them. It became his most sacred place, and he would return here throughout his life. What he learned here would determine the future of much of Asia for centuries to come.
Life is utterly miserable at this point, but Temujin is bound by the law of his people. He adheres to their code of honor. And when he finds out that his own half-brother is concealing food from him and the family, he doesn't hesitate in killing him. And after committing this deed, he pledges to his mother, "We will return to claim what is rightly ours."
His mind was fixed. Right and wrong, black and white. There was no gray, only red.
True to his word, Temujin returns to wreak a terrible revenge on the Tatars. He slaughters them, he murders them for what they did to his father.
It was merely a first step, a first taste of the river of blood that was soon to follow. Rarely in history has the word slaughter carried the weight it did with Temujin. His ultimatum was absolute: bend or die. Without total submission, there would be total annihilation. Once proud tribes wiped from the face of the earth, no mercy shown to the elderly, women, or children. Fear, however, wasn't his only weapon. As he set about uniting the warring tribes of the Mongolian steppe, he would seek alliances with other tribes, offering to spare their lives if they swore loyalty as his allies. He would even invite enemy generals to be his own generals. Anything that would strengthen his forces and expand his territory and influence.
It took Genghis Khan as long to unite the tribes around him as it did to conquer the world.
To him, the Mongols were one people, and together under his leadership, they would be unbeatable. Some surrendered, some fought, many died. But all eventually fell into line.
And at the age of 44, he becomes the universal leader of the Mongolian tribes. And Europe is put on notice that what is about to dawn is the age of the Mongolian Empire.
It was then that he took the name we know him by today, Genghis Khan, or Universal Leader. For the previously divided people of Mongolia, he changed everything. A meritocracy was born that saw low and high-born fighting side by side with their great Khan. With a united Mongolia behind him, Genghis had one of the world's greatest fighting forces at his disposal, and the richest lands all easily accessible from their home on the steppe.
The Eurasian steppe stretches from the Hungarian basin all the way through to the Pacific coastline of China. And it's not savanna, it's not grassland, it's not desert. It's a kind of combination of all three. But it's a featureless and inhospitable landscape that stretches as far as the eye can see.
And Genghis's eyes were set on the riches, trade, and learning that lived just beyond the boundaries of his tribal lands.
Europe and the Middle East were settled agricultural societies with growing towns and cities. You could say they'd gone soft. They were civilized. They were enjoying the growing creature comforts of everyday life. Things couldn't have been more different for the Mongols out on the steppe. They were hard, they were determined, they were ruthless.
In every way, these were people of extremes.
The Mongolian people were shaped by their landscape. Bonds of trust and loyalty were not only important, they were essential to survival. People were either sworn friends or sworn enemies, and treachery was punished with the utmost severity. People had to rely on each other to survive on the steppe.
And the steppe brought them one further advantage, one that would play a huge role in their dominance on the battlefield: the horse.
Horses were first domesticated on the steppe, and for those who lived in that landscape, the horse was everything. It was their mode of transport. It was even a source of food in terms of the milk, for example, from which they even distilled alcohol. It was a form of sustaining them in their long journeys, in their military campaigns.
There were legends of warriors who could ride for miles, outflanking enemies and relaying battlefield messages at speed over tough terrain.
The people of the steppe were literally at one with their horses.
It is said they could ride at a gallop before they could walk, so skilled on horseback that they could shoot birds out of the sky whilst riding at full speed. This was an army the likes of which the world has never seen.
The horse was very literally the war horse of the Mongolian tribes. It allowed for war at incredible speed and pace.
And it was that speed, combined with battlefield flexibility, that created one of the most feared military machines in history. His battles in Mongolia took him the best part of 2 decades with remarkably few defeats. By 1206, the army that emerged under him was built in his image, with codified values of loyalty, meritocracy, and ruthlessness. Genghis Khan's young Mongolian army would go on to rout nations and armies that had been established for centuries and simply brush them aside. They took the whole world by surprise.
None of these people had any idea of the looming cloud that was heading towards them from the Eurasian steppe, from a place they had no knowledge of.
Yet for someone who made such sweeping changes across much of the world, we know little about the man himself. Could his brutal conquests across Asia and Eastern Europe hold the key to understanding the man? Will it help to reveal the answer to the biggest mystery of all? The final resting place of Genghis Khan, the greatest warrior of all time. Genghis Khan, who rose from a childhood in exile, avenged his father's death, and united the nomadic tribes under his one banner. His tactical brilliance was matched only by his fearlessness in battle and brutality in victory. For centuries, his name would command fear and obedience from the Pacific to the Baltic. But he has no mausoleum, no gravestone, no tomb. His burial place has been kept secret for 750 years. Now, a team of historians and scientists has come together to tease out the facts.
I think the reason why we're so fascinated by Genghis Khan and the Mongolian people is the landscape that they live in and the wild place that they really conquer.
At the investigation headquarters, Dr. Fern Riddell has been looking at his life and incredible military success to see what clues they hold.
What fueled the desire of Genghis Khan and the Mongolian people was the belief that their quest for conquest was divine, that this was something they were supposed to do, it was their birthright.
And this self-identity knew no limits and held no esteem for age-old customs and long-held beliefs.
The belief in their divine right was so strong that when they were contacted by the Pope for an audience, they believed that he would be coming to them.
The unshakable belief that the world belonged to them and every person was theirs to kill or command saw the Mongol army rampage across Asia, dominating every foe. Though history has painted the horde to appear as little more than barbarians, killing without thought in a frenzy of bloodlust, the truth was very different.
When we hear the word horde, we tend to think of something that's really disorganized and quite ramshackle. But the reality is they were the most disciplined fighting force, and there's no way they would have been able to conquer as many nations, armies, and civilizations if they hadn't had that discipline. Genghis Khan had a tried and tested method of conquest. First, he would establish a network of spies to assess strengths and weaknesses, and then he would send an emissary with the message, surrender or die.
Their military efficiency, when faced with the wealthy cities of Asia, was nothing short of miraculous, and born largely of the fear they instilled. It's said that to Genghis, enemy fighters were prey to be hunted. Citizens, simply cattle to be used or slaughtered.
When they attacked cities, they did so without mercy. Every man, woman, and child was killed. No one was missed and no one was spared.
It was this perfect blend of speed, skill, and ruthlessness of the Mongolian people, all harnessed by Genghis Khan, that made the Mongolian Empire possible. First, he had united the tribes. Now he was set to conquer the world.
The first people to fall victim to Genghis Khan's expansion were the Tangut of the Zhizhar, and it took him 4 years to conquer them. But by the end, he'd managed to win their absolute loyalty and the pledge that if he ever needed them, they would come to his aid. Genghis Khan then went on a lightning rampage. It took 10 years, but by the end of that, across East Asia and China, he had conquered millions of people and millions of square miles.
And part of what made his empire possible was the PR campaign that moved ahead of the war machine. Those who had escaped the slaughter spread the word across Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and even Africa.
We talk about the Horde as being utterly merciless, and they were. But part of that is the time that they're living in. And if you're going to go on this massive expansion, then you have to have a reputation that is deadly and absolutely precedes you.
This fearsome reputation meant fewer battles. When the price of defeat is total annihilation, surrender can become more palatable. Those that did surrender found that Genghis Khan was not perhaps the devil they imagined.
In order to understand why we've never been able to find Genghis Khan's tomb, we have to understand the Mongolian way of life, and part of that is their code of conduct, the yasa. It was a way of living, a way of being, not only that your word was your bond, but also a vast number of crimes that you could be executed for. This code of conduct was not just for them, but for everyone they interacted with.
This was a text that controlled every aspect of society, determining everything from how to wash up to the regulation of the treatment and execution of defeated enemies. The Yasa had similarities to other legal systems of the time, with a basis in the Ten Commandments, and some of the rules were surprisingly forward-thinking. And others remarkably brutal and show Genghis's intolerance of the diktats of the major world religions.
The Yasa Code of Conduct might sound incredibly restrictive, but we also have to acknowledge that the Mongolian Empire was the first place in the world to have freedom of religious expression. Genghis Khan didn't mind who you believed in or what you believed in, as long as you bent the knee to him. This reputation for religious tolerance is one of the reasons why Genghis Khan was able to expand so quickly. It gave him a reputation as a just and strong leader.
The Yasa is known and understood because it long outlived its creator. Aside from the code, there are almost no contemporary Mongolian accounts of Genghis Khan's dramatic rise, deepening the mystery and myth that surrounds him. All that exists is the secret history of the Mongols, and it is brilliant in its simplicity.
Such is the Mongolian pride in their prowess in battle that their only written history is just a simple list of how many people were killed and how much land was taken.
These battles that destroyed cultures and civilizations or defined them for centuries to come were the most significant events in the lives of millions of people. Terrifying events that would go down in history. But for the Mongols, it was just another day.
An attack by a Mongolian army was a truly fearful thing. Wave after wave of horse, a tsunami of arrows. In fact, the massacres that occurred are rarely worth a mention in the Mongolian histories.
Not all who died did so in battle. The penalty for taking on Genghis Khan was death. Whether you were a soldier or not, there were no innocent bystanders in this new world order.
At their peak, the Mongolian army was the most feared in the world. Whole peoples would surrender just to avoid total annihilation. And we know that during their 20-year expansion, roughly 20 to 70 million people met their end.
That equates to around 20% of the global population at the time. And news of the terror from the east reached far beyond the borders of Genghis Khan's empire. Aside from all the slaughter and bloodshed, he was, above all else, a unifying force. The threat of annihilation brought once divided people together under the Khan's single banner. They exchanged goods, knowledge, stories, and songs.
Genghis Khan's empire was so vast that at its eastern tip, it stretched from the Pacific Ocean in China, south to the Himalayas in India, and then west to the Sea of Azov in Ukraine. The lasting legacy of Genghis Khan's empire is the fact that he united East and West, allowing these vast areas of land to be at peace for the first time. that created trade routes that we still use today.
The clarity of history has allowed us to take a more objective view of Genghis Khan's legacy. The people of Europe had no need to fear. He wasn't coming for them. With his sights set on conquering the Middle East, Khan called upon his first subjects, the Tangut or Jija, to fulfill their obligation.
In 1227, the Jija refused to fulfill their 20-year-old promise of military aid to Genghis Khan. True to his word, Genghis returned, promising to annihilate them from the face of the earth. While he was on this campaign, Genghis Khan possibly becomes ill or injured, but he definitely dies. And this is the moment where myth and legend combine.
After 40 years of almost ceaseless battle, the journey of one of the world's greatest ever warriors is almost at an end. But his death is merely the beginning of the mystery. Where was his body taken? Was he ill or injured? Had he been killed? Why did he not receive a lavish burial? And can we ever know for certain where he might rest? Genghis Khan, the man who rose from a mountain cave to control the largest land empire in history. Unwavering in his belief that the world belonged to the Mongolian people, he offered a simple ultimatum to everyone in his path: surrender or die. His legendary ruthlessness and brutality left tens of millions dead and entire civilizations to crumble. But he allowed self-rule, religious freedom, and protection to all who submitted to him. To those in his way, he was the devil. To his followers, a living god. But how can such a figure disappear without a trace? Where is the tomb of Genghis Khan? Anthropologist Karen Bellinger is sifting through the evidence.
People are always curious about what becomes of the great men of history, and Genghis Khan, who formed the largest contiguous land empire ever known, certainly qualifies as a big man. So, how is it possible we don't know where he ended up after he died?
She is retracing the Khan's steps, seeing if his steadfast beliefs could provide the clues we need.
It's August 1227, and Genghis is in northwest China with his troops, and they're putting down a rebellion among the Jija, who had failed to support him militarily as they had promised to do so many years before.
Then, suddenly, Genghis Khan falls ill and dies. The secret history of the Mongols says he fell from his horse while hunting and succumbed to his injuries. Some say he was assassinated by the Jija, others that he was mutilated while engaging with a concubine. And one modern theory claims compelling evidence that he contracted the bubonic plague. The cause of his death will forever be a mystery. Unless, of course, his tomb can be found. We do, however, know a little of what happened before he died.
On his deathbed, as in life, Genghis Khan controlled the situation. He gathered his trusted advisors. He delivered his wishes for the succession.
The great Khan divided his empire amongst his 4 sons, entrusting overall leadership to the second youngest, Ogadai. He also left explicit instructions for the fate of the Jija. Despite the fact he'd softened in his later years, he could not forgive their betrayal. They were to be exterminated completely. No soul spared, no mercy shown.
After his death, they accomplished his wishes regarding the Jija and more. They conquered the entirety of China under the Yuan dynasty, which ruled for 2 centuries, and made incursions into Eastern Europe and the Middle East.
Assured that his wishes would be carried out to the letter after his death, just as they were in his life, Genghis Khan died in enemy territory. Is it possible he was buried there?
We know Genghis was in China, over 300 miles from home when he died. He hated China, so it's kind of hard for me to imagine he would have allowed himself to be buried there. If he was aware enough of what was happening just before his death to plan the succession, I have to also think he would have directed his advisors to get him home. But when it comes to this search for his tomb, I have to feel as an anthropologist that we need to look more closely at beliefs around death and burial rites of his people. And that hasn't really been a focus to date, and honestly, I don't know why.
Thanks to the secret history of the Mongols and other surviving texts from outposts of the Mongolian Empire at the time, we know a little about their beliefs and practices, and that death was not a matter for discussion.
Even to this day, Mongolians don't like to talk about death a whole lot. And the belief is that upon death, the spirit leaves the body and it enters the spirit banner. And the body at that point is expendable and potentially dangerous. It needs to be disposed of.
Their belief was that as soon as the spirit left the body, demons and evil spirits would try to take its place. Most burials would take place shortly after death, in simple, unmarked graves. But this was the man who created Mongolia, who led his people to a mighty empire. Surely it could not be a shallow grave left in enemy territory. Legend has it that years beforehand, Khan had given instructions for his burial, and they would have been carried out.
Is it possible his body was brought back to Mongolia? Well, we have an account in the secret histories that tells of 1,000 people who witnessed that procession and were executed because of it.
Such was the desire to keep Genghis Khan's resting place a secret that anyone who even laid eyes on the coffin was immediately put to death. With this knowledge, can we have any hope of finding his tomb? And would we know what it looked like if we found it?
Let's say they did bring Genghis back to Mongolia. What then? Well, we do have the example of an ancestral group called the Xiongnu, who buried their elites in elaborate tombs 20 meters underground. They lined them with wood and they filled them with treasures representing their earthly accomplishments. If Genghis were buried in that fashion, we could imagine indeed it would be a wealthy trove.
But despite his vast wealth and power, Genghis Khan never succumbed to the temptations of his riches. Still choosing to live in traditional gurs rather than palatial luxury. Legend has it that he never set foot in a building in his whole life. The traditional Mongol way seems to have changed a little in his lifetime.
While it's appealing to imagine there is a lavish tomb waiting to be found, the fact is that burial practices of the time were much more tied into nomadic lifestyles, and the Mongols were far more likely to lash a body to a horse and send it off into the steppe, or perform a sky burial. Despite these traditional options that would have shaped Mongolian approaches to burial, Genghis Khan being Genghis Khan, it's entirely possible he came up with a whole new solution. And no one's going to question the great Khan.
Despite the frustrating lack of physical or written evidence, there are anecdotal accounts that could bring vital clues to help solve the mystery. Though if one legend is to be believed, it's quite possible that anybody who ever knew where he was buried didn't live long enough to tell the tale.
The story goes that he was buried in a tomb, and all those involved were executed. And when the executioners returned to the capital city of Karakoram, they in turn were killed. As in everything, control and secrecy were paramount.
If this is true, if all involved in the burial were killed, then there can be no record of the location. The more we learn, the greater the challenge grows. If Genghis Khan was buried, then it's likely to have been a tomb of significant size, matching his unparalleled stature.
Given the Mongolian tradition of unmarked graves, raises the legitimate question of how they would disguise such a sizable ground disturbance. And one idea is that a river was diverted, or perhaps 1,000 horses were set to trample over the site, removing any traces from the surface. Archaeologists have scouted some areas that seem to fit some of these descriptions, but we're talking about a landmass the size of Germany, France, and Spain combined. It's a vast wilderness with a population of 3 million people, none of whom want Genghis Khan's last resting place to be found.
And there is one place in particular that has been the focus of attention from archaeologists: Khan's mystical mountain.
The Burkhan Khaldun is a mountain of great significance to Mongolians, and to Genghis particularly. It's the place where he sought refuge after his father was killed and he'd been cast out by his own tribe. He returned many times in his life to worship and for contemplation, and he even allegedly once said, "Bury me here when I die."
Searching for a tomb with no record? On ground that may now be under a river? Or could have been trampled by 1,000 horses many centuries ago? An impossible mission. But the obstacles don't stop there. If Genghis Khan was indeed laid to rest at his beloved sacred mountain, then there are two very significant hurdles to overcome.
The Burkhan Khaldun has been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And that means that any kind of archaeological exploration is going to be severely limited, if allowed at all. But more importantly, the site is of great cultural significance to the Mongolian people.
Could it be that there is no hope of finding the tomb? That those who buried Genghis Khan did their job of hiding it too well? Or could their ancestors, the Mongolian people, prevent any significant discovery from being made? One man believes he has all the answers, including the final resting place of the leader of the Mongols. Genghis Khan, one of the greatest military leaders and empire builders the world has ever seen. His conquests are the stuff of legend and took the lives of up to 70 million people. As many as 1 in 200 people alive today are his direct descendants. Yet we have no contemporary images of him, no paintings, no etchings, no statues, and no tomb. We know how he lived. We know where he died. But can our experts finally solve the mystery of where he was buried?
Most archaeologists don't really devote themselves to looking for individual tombs or individual kinds of leaders in history. But in the case of Genghis Khan, there are certainly some individuals among archaeologists who are quite interested in finding his tomb.
Dr. Mark Altaweel is an archaeologist and data scientist.
For most of human history, societies, countries, large movements perhaps, have influenced historical dynamics or history in general. But in the case of Genghis Khan, he is one of those rare individuals where he himself had a dramatic impact on history. To this day, we feel the repercussions of his actions and influence on history.
For Mark, the scale of the Khan's achievements in life frame the questions around what burial he may have had and its location.
In terms of where Genghis Khan's burial might be located, one possibility is Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain to the Mongolians. The more likely possibility, in my opinion, is really a sky burial, an open burial that would have meant that his body have disappeared, that we will not actually find any evidence of Genghis Khan, given that his remains were exposed to the elements.
Even though they viewed the body as an empty vessel after death, would the Mongolian people have allowed the body of their leader, their hero, to be left to the vultures?
Sky burials are types of burials that are located often in high places or even open places. They're typical among nomadic groups that we find in Central Asia and really throughout even Eurasia. So among the Mongols, this is quite a typical type of burial. The idea is that once the body dies or once the person dies, effectively they return back to the elements. So in some ways it's comparable to the idea in the West that from the earth we came from to the earth we return after we die.
Yet despite a sky burial fitting with the Mongol traditions of the time, and any lack of evidence of a burial site, there are some archaeologists who believe there is a tomb and have become obsessed with finding it. Some locals, however, have had more luck.
In 2004, a joint Japanese and Mongolian team uncovered a palace about 150 miles east of Ulaanbaatar, the modern capital of Mongolia. Now, this palace, if it's true, does seem to be a contradiction. That is, the idea was that we're not supposed to find his tomb, yet if there's a palace that may date to this period and may link to his tomb, then potentially we've found a residence that may be linked to the burial of Genghis Khan.
Is it possible that everything we thought we knew was wrong? The secrecy, the executions, the diverted river. Could that all have just been cover? Could a grand mausoleum really have been built for the great Khan? The team that discovered the palace believes so.
There are texts that mention, for instance, visits between a tomb and a palace. On the other hand, there's no place of veneration that we know of in other texts. So this is one possibility, but yet at the same time contradicts our previous knowledge.
The balance of probability means that a tomb attached to a palace is highly unlikely. Not only does it conflict with everything we know about Genghis Khan, but for his tomb not to have written evidence of its construction is difficult to reconcile with the general view of historical figures. To this day, Khan is venerated by his people. A visible tomb would have been a site of pilgrimage for the last 8 centuries, not a buried ruin. There is, however, one man who believes he has all the answers.
Alan Nichols claims to have found the mountain burial place of Genghis Khan because he's basically accounted for things like the route, terrain, as well as the specific mountain, which he thinks was a holy mountain. He has called this mountain Mountain X, and he alone claims to know where this site is.
Alan Nichols is a 92-year-old American author and lawyer, and an expert on Tibet, China, and Mongolia. He first heard of the search for Genghis Khan's tomb when he was cycling the 4,000-mile route through the Silk Road, and he quickly became obsessed.
Alan Nichols claims to be looking for Genghis Khan's tomb for educational purposes. He wants to basically elevate Genghis Khan at the same level as Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. He sees him as one of these great conquerors in history, a person who's really a father figure to a nation, to the Mongols.
Nichols wouldn't be alone in believing that Genghis hasn't had the same recognition as other historical figures, reduced to a simple barbarian in the eyes of the West. But his impact lingers to this day. His last ruling direct descendant died only a century ago, and the discovery of his tomb would certainly prompt a discussion about his achievements and impact on the modern world. So, where is Mountain X? Nichols claims that the text and the geography all point to a mountain in the Yin Range, near the Yellow River and the capital city of Inner Mongolia, Hohhot. He hopes to return to the site with ground X-ray and magnetology tools to prove his theory, but he's unlikely to receive any help to do so.
Now, the Mongolian state is quite sensitive about anyone excavating or looking for the tomb of Genghis Khan. We have to think of Genghis Khan as a really critical figure in the history of Mongolia. He is literally the father of the nation. He is the person who brought the various tribes and people together to create a place that we may call Mongolia. We can think of it as kind of like a founding father such as George Washington, for instance, at Mount Rushmore. If you look at his face, it's about 60 feet tall. A comparable example might be the statue for Genghis Khan in Mongolia, where it's over 130 feet tall.
Mark Altawil sees the search for Genghis Khan's tomb as an endeavor for the Mongolian people alone. He's their hero, their Khan, and they may not want him found.
Can you imagine if a place like in the United States would allow a foreign team or foreigners to come to investigate and look for their founding fathers' tombs, such as George Washington or Thomas Jefferson? Imagine if we didn't know where they were buried. It's that kind of level. It would be extremely offensive, really, for anybody else to look for a founding father of a nation outside of the nation itself.
With the message from the Mongolian people being loud and clear, is it likely that the quest to find his final resting place will eventually just fizzle out?
Genghis Khan is one of the world's really great historical figures, and because of this, I don't think people will stop looking for his tomb. This is an unfortunate side effect of being famous.
Is it possible that the great Khan foresaw this? That a man who had made such an impact in life would never be allowed to truly rest in peaceful death? Did this mean he trusted in the Mongol way and committed his body to the sky?
I don't think we should be looking for the tomb of Genghis Khan. In many ways, I find it a bit of a vanity project to really continue looking. We should respect the wishes of the Mongolian people.
Our team has finished their investigation. The achievements of Genghis Khan are astonishing. Maybe the bigger mystery is why he is not widely recognized as one of the greatest military or national leaders the world has ever seen.
Genghis Khan, for me, is an absolutely fascinating figure.
But if he even had a tomb, which is far from certain, it seems unlikely the Mongolian people will ever allow it to be found.
Some have floated theories that the Mongols have somehow placed a curse on Genghis Khan's tomb, but for me, as an anthropologist, it just comes down to the fact that the Mongolians have a set of beliefs around death, and venerated leaders should just be left in peace.
And perhaps finding the tomb of the great Khan shouldn't be the focus of archaeologists. Perhaps we should look more at the man himself.
The life of Genghis Khan is far more interesting than the death of Genghis Khan.
A man who united his people, gave them a place in the world, linked the East to the West, and created the foundations of the modern world. Genghis Khan, the universal ruler.